Hello and welcome. This is Fire Workflow with far more people in the room than I expected because this is sort of a more advanced presentation, so that's awesome. My name is Lloyd McKenzie. Many of you have probably seen me on chat.fhir.org. If you haven't seen me on chat.fhir.org, you should get there because that is the best way to engage the community, to ask questions, to answer questions, to figure out what the heck's going on and who is doing what. I've been involved in HL7 for way too long, since long before we even dreamed of FHIR. So I know version 2 and version 3. I proclaimed the joys of version 3 for almost a decade before FHIR came along, and it now consumes most of my spare time and some of my not spare time. So I'm going to talk to you about workflow. My role in workflow is I am a co-chair of FHIR Infrastructure, which manages the FHIR Workflow project, and I am the co-chair who runs those calls. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about where we came from in the workflow space. HL7 has been doing interoperability for over 30 years. I have the t-shirt that proclaims that. Version 2 is all about messaging, and most of version 3, with the exception of CDA, which we'll talk about in a second, is also about messaging. And messaging workflows are relatively simple. You've got a single sender, you've typically got one receiver, although sometimes you do a broadcast and say, hey, I've been a patient, here's all their information, do whatever you need to do. Messaging has an event code that says what the heck has happened. And that indicates to whoever receives the message what they ought to do with that. So whether it's pick up a scalpel or start counting pills or change a status or send a report or do something or other. And sometimes they don't do anything at all, and all of that's driven by the code. Messaging can be synchronous, although a fair bit of it in the version 2 space is asynchronous. And that's where we've been for quite a long time. The next significant standard besides version 2 and version 3 that we have in HL7 is CDA, or Clinical Document Architecture. And it's all about documents. And documents in and of themselves have no innate workflow. When you pick up a document, you don't want somebody to automatically start counting pills or start picking up a scalpel because you don't know exactly who's going to pick it up or when they're going to pick it up or how often they're going to pick it up. So you need to have some sort of a wrapper around a document if you want workflow to occur. And IHE has spent a fair bit of time and energy building specifications that wrap things around CDA to allow workflow to occur when the transport mechanism itself isn't innately about workflow. And then along comes FHIR. And with FHIR, HL7 suddenly had something that we hadn't had before, which was REST. And REST opened up a number of different options in terms of workflow. And it also opened up the question of, so when is it appropriate to use REST for workflow, and when are we actually better off using messaging? Because, of course, FHIR can do messaging too. In fact, FHIR can do documents as well. And then the other piece of it is if we would like workflow to be consistent, and consistency is generally a good thing in the standard space. How do we get that consistency across our resources and across how workflow behaves? Because when we started out with FHIR, each of our different resources, so whether it was observation or medication administration or patient or whatever, all of those resources were created by different work groups and given the instructions, design your structures based on what the domain knows and what the domain uses. And we aren't going to drive things from a consistent common reference model. We're going to drive things from what people use, and then we'll worry about consistency after the fact. And we needed to worry about that consistency after the fact because there were variances that weren't necessarily there because they needed to be. They were there because there were different people at the controls when we were creating the models. Workflow is somewhat of an advanced topic in FHIR. It's not typically the first thing that people pick up when they do FHIR. The first thing that people typically do when they encounter FHIR is let's expose my data as read-only. And then maybe at some point I'll start exposing some of my data for write. Exposing your workflow processes is sort of an additional layer of interoperability on top of that, because it requires much more consistency and it requires much more trust if you're going to start letting external systems drive how your internal system behaves. So in truth, we haven't seen tons of that happening in the FHIR space, but we're starting to see it now, and the workflow project is intended to help provide some answers, and hopefully I'll give some of those today. Everything that you're going to see today came out of the FHIR workflow project, which has been running over 2 years now. We meet for 2 hours a week, usually, not this week. And we've been doing 3 main things. One is patterns for resources. So what are the things that should be, or at least could be, consistent across the different resources that will allow us to apply workflow in the same fashion, whether we're in the pharmacy space, or in the lab space, or in the imaging space, or in the can I have a set of bed sheets, please, space. Second is workflow execution. So what is the mechanism in FHIR, or what are the set of mechanisms in FHIR that you use to say, hey, can you please do something? Or can somebody please do something? How do you ask? How do you answer? And how do you negotiate? And the third part of that, which we haven't spent as much time on, in part because it's heavily overlapped with clinical decision support, is how do you define workflow processes? So how do you describe what workflows can exist or should exist, or what is the next step that you should take? So let's start with patterns. Patterns got introduced to FHIR in large part from the workflow project. We needed to be able to define structures that were not resources. These are not things that you can actually send over the wire, but that sort of behaved like resources in that they had properties, they had relationships, they had all of the things that resources have, other than we don't have schemas for them because the intention is not to share them, the intention is to map to them. And we came up with 3 of them. And for those of you who have been around HL7 for a while, you might recognize some of these names. They do come or are informed by HL7's reference information model. We didn't set out that way. It just turns out that the reference information model has some useful things in it, and this was part of that. And so we start with the bottom, which is a little bit weird, which is the definition. These are the things that can happen. Think about protocols, think about order sets, think about a questionnaire, a list of questions that can be asked. And we don't always have these in healthcare. Sometimes they're implicit, sometimes they exist, but we don't bother to talk about them. But they are things that we have resources in FHIR to manage. And there's a number of relationships there in that definitions can rely on other definitions. They can contain other definitions. They can replace each other, et cetera. The next stage in things is the request or the intent. And that's where our orders, our proposals, our plans, all of the things that we would like to happen that are typically tied to a particular patient or to a particular time span that we would like to have happen or that we think are going to happen, we have resources that deal with those. And then we have events, the things that are actually happening right now or happened at some point in the past. And we tie all of those things together. And when we take a look at which of the FHIR resources fit into one of these patterns, it's actually quite a few. Not quite so many definitional resources, more requests, and lots of events. And our objective in defining those patterns was, let's get some consistency so that where we can have things named the same way, have things have the same data types, have some of the same properties, et cetera, whether we're looking at the financial space or the administrative space or the clinical space, because where we can get consistency, where that makes sense, that tends to benefit implementers. That may be a bit small for some of you to see. You can see all of these things just by going to the HL7 specification. One of the little main sections there is workflow. And if you click on that, you'll be able to get to the workflow patterns. These are the data elements that we think are relatively consistent for all definitions. A lot of them are basic metadata things. Who created this? What's its name? When was it created? What's the status of it? Who is it about? And these are pieces of information that we try to have consistent across all of our definitions. So that includes things like some of the clinical decision support structures, plan definition, activity definition. It applies to questionnaire. It applies to a number of different resources. We have request, which adds on some additional things and takes away some other things. We don't typically have titles for orders, but we do have identifiers for them. We have a code that says, what are you ordering? We have who you're ordering it for. We have a link to the encounter or to the episode of care that it's part of, who asked for it, possibly a link to insurance information, whether it's just a basic plan or to extended coverage, that sort of thing. All of this looks and behaves much like a resource, but what we actually do to this behind the scenes is we map from every single FHIR resource that is relevant to the workflow space to these properties. So not every single resource will necessarily have zero to many identifiers. Some resources say, you know what, I've never seen a real system where they've had more than one. People just assign a single identifier as the source of truth, and everybody respects that, and nobody else assigns their own. It doesn't make sense for us to have multiple identifiers in our space, and that's okay. We don't drive the FHIR resources from the patterns. We align with the patterns where it makes sense to do so. Similarly, there are places where the subject can only be a patient. It can't be a device, it can't be a group, it can't be anything else. And in those situations, we typically label the element as patient because we want to be specific. So again, the names of things may not be identical, but the mappings are present to allow you to know that, by the way, this element here is the same as that element in that resource and the same as that element in that other resource. And through those mappings, we can start to build interface layers into the reference implementations, which is something that we're exploring right now. Same sort of a pattern for event. Event is the first one of these that actually breaks things out into something a little bit more complex. Performer is broken out into a separate element. By the way, I'm not explaining what a resource is because I'm assuming all of you have had the equivalent of an introduction to FHIR or you wouldn't be in this room. If you haven't, you can make a bolt for the door. There's another tutorial that's more of an introduction to FHIR. I probably should have said that at the beginning when it was easier to bolt. So I'm assuming that you know how to read these diagrams and have seen the FHIR specification. But with performers, events can have multiple performers, and we believe that most of the resources have the ability to track what kind of performer they are. How they do that might vary. Some of them have a structure like this where it's a zero to many and you identify the performer type with an attribute. Others simply have a couple of named performer types and they sort of merge that structure in. We're comfortable with however they choose to do it. Patterns are not rules. There are things in the patterns that are not necessarily relevant everywhere. The notion of insurance coverage doesn't typically matter on an allergy. It's not the kind of thing that you typically capture there. And we would not expect that to be introduced. We wouldn't even expect it to be supported with an extension because it's not a requirement that anybody's brought forward to us. Other things might exist occasionally, and we can see how they could potentially be useful. But when we look across most implementations, we don't see a lot of support for that element. And in that case, we have a common set of extensions that can be used to represent these things on resources where they're not common. And where they are common, then they show up in the resource, sometimes with the same name as in the pattern, sometimes with something different. The main driver of this part of the workflow process is trying to encourage consistency where the existing inconsistency isn't there on purpose. It's there accidentally because different people were making the decisions and we didn't really think about, well, yeah, I guess that element is actually relevant. We just hadn't thought about that yet. Or, well, we named it author because we wanted to name it author because that's what we were used to, but we could possibly name it something else. And being consistent would be a useful thing. So this will drive increasing consistency of the FHIR models. We had hoped to be further along at this point in release 4 than we are. It's taken us a bit longer to get some of the tooling in place, and frankly, most of the work groups have been rather busy with change requests coming in to have a lot of time to pay attention to this. But it is something that we're continuing to drive and continuing to work towards. The mappings that we have are of a style that I call hand-wavy mappings, which means that they are useful for humans to look at and understand what this means, but they may have free text in them as an explanation of how this behaves. They are not useful for code generation. We are looking at the possibility to moving to more formal mappings that we can use to generate code, because one of the things that would be nice to be able to do is to introduce into our reference implementations the notion of this is a request. And I can manipulate all requests, whether they are medication requests or service requests or even an invoice or insurance claim as a request. And those would all expose the same consistent set of properties that I can manipulate and process from a workflow perspective. So we have not got there yet. We know that there are some gotchas and that the alignment isn't necessarily so clean that a computable mapping will always be possible, but we're going to try to move in that direction, particularly if we get some encouragement from the implementer community who says that they actually want that. We've had a few people express interest, but more people who want it are certainly welcome to make themselves known. The other thing that we're going to be doing is introducing some additional patterns. So this set of patterns has been driven by the workflow process, but we will also be looking at patterns around demographics in patient and related person and person and practitioner. We'll be looking at patterns in the substances space, so substance and medication and device and things like that. So we will hopefully see some of that stuff as well. Second part of workflow is how do you ask for something to be done? And so let's start with the problem statement. Imagine that you have a pharmacy and the pharmacy has received 2 different prescriptions. Both of them are for a patient that uses the pharmacy, so the pharmacy knows who the heck they are. They're both digitally signed, fully valid prescriptions. You can't really make changes to them so that they look different from each other, because doing that would break the signature. The difference is what the intention is for the pharmacy in passing them that prescription. In one case, the physician is passing the pharmacy the prescription because I would like you to fill this. The patient's going to show up in 15 minutes and they'd kind of like their meds ready. In the other case, it's for your information. I've actually already provided them the med because I had some on hand, or we got a dispensing pharmacy in the clinic. And I'm just passing this on to you as a for your information so that you're aware that the patient is on this antibiotic, so that if they get prescribed something else by somebody else, you can do proper drug-drug interaction checking. And the challenge that we have, particularly in the RESTful space, is how do we differentiate between those two? Because we can't change the resource. Changing the resource would break the signature, and we need some way, a mechanism of doing that. One of the things that became evident to us in the workflow project early on is that there's actually a difference between the request resource, or the order, or the plan, or the proposal, and the task or the fulfillment request, the asking for something to be done. The resource that we have for service request or medication request or claim or whatever are in and of themselves authorizations. They are granting permission for something to happen or indicating a desire for something to happen, but they aren't specifically asking any particular individual to do it now or to do all of it now. There are situations where you might have a prescription or a lab order where the order is for a year's worth, but you might want, in terms of dispensing or in terms of actual lab blood draws, only one to happen or 30 days worth to happen. And you need to be able to separate the, hey, pharmacy X, can you please give patient 30 days worth of medication from the overall authorization that says they can have a year's worth. And so the medication request is the authorization. It says what's allowed to occur. And we have a separate resource that we introduced in release 2. It was actually 2 resources called order and order response. They were theoretical and hadn't been well exercised and were actually somewhat broken, so they don't work very well. If you're implementing STU2, come talk to us about how to kind of make them work. But in release 3, we introduced task for this purpose of saying, I would like something to be done. And task is our generic workhorse anytime that we want to ask for something to be done. Whether that is please fulfill, please change status, please tell me the current progress, all of those can be done with task. Task is an interesting resource in that it's the only resource that we have that tries to instantiate both the request and the event pattern because it spans both worlds. It lets you ask for something to be done, but it also lets you track what has been done. With task, we have the ability to restrict what's being executed. So the authorization might say that you're allowed to do this 10 times, but the task says I'd like you to do it twice. Or the authorization might say this is good for the next 18 months, because that's as long as I'm legally allowed to prescribe in my jurisdiction. But the period in the task might say 3 months. In some cases, you might have a task that says, for this particular herd of cows, we have this prescription. But we're going to instantiate that on a single cow because they had special needs or whatever. Cows have special needs too. And have a task to deal with that particular problem calf. With task, we also have the ability to have input and output parameters. And that's actually a rendering problem. Both of those should say parameter. It should point to the same thing twice. I'm not sure why it doesn't. And so you can provide input into the task that's going to be executed, and you can also capture the results. The easiest way to understand the difference between request and task is probably to look at their state machines. The request state machine is pretty simple. You can have a draft order or proposal or plan that is not signed off, it's not ready to be acted upon, somebody's just messing around, putting stuff into their system. And you might pass that around still. You might share that because you're doing clinical decision support and you're saying, I'm thinking about prescribing this. Is that going to cause any problems, any drug-drug interactions, any allergies? So you might pass around a draft, but it's not yet an active request. Then it goes to active. This is now authorized. You might suspend it for a while, so it's not currently authorized, but we intend to make it authorized again eventually. Then it either gets completed, so we consider the whatever was authorized to now be done, or we revoke the authorization. And of course, everything in FHIR pretty much can also be marked as entered in error as, whoops, this didn't really happen, but you probably saw it, so rather than just making it disappear from the world and leaving you confused, we will leave it in the world, but we will explicitly mark it as entered in error so that you know that it never really happened. And people often look at that request state machine and say, but I've got a whole bunch of other statuses that I use in version 2 or version 3 or other places. Where did they go? And the answer is they probably went into task. Because task is where we deal with the notion of this has been requested. This has been received. I have accepted this. I agree to do it, or no, I won't do it. It's in progress. All of that kind of stuff. Realistically, there's probably some additional statuses that you will have, and those will vary by resource, and those will also vary by specific business flow. So has the lab results been resulted? Has it been reviewed? Has it been confirmed? Has it been authorized? All of these different internal processing steps. So in parallel with this state machine, which is standard that we expect all systems to adhere to or map to, we also have a business status element which allows you to convey the more nuanced status in your particular space. And we're not expecting interoperability across all resources, across the world in that particular space, because we're not anywhere close to getting that level of interoperability and agreement and consistency yet. But we figure we're pretty reasonable to get interoperability for this part. You don't necessarily have to have all of the overhead of task. It is possible to just pass somebody a resource and flag it to say, please execute, and not have the notion of requested and received and accepted or rejected and in progress, because that just doesn't exist in your particular world. So task is not something you have to use, but it's something that's available for use, and implicitly it's always there whenever you're asking for something to happen. So in some cases there might be an implicit task that you haven't exposed, but if you ever wanted to start sharing with systems the nuance of where things are at, task is your mechanism for doing that. We've created a number of workflow patterns. They are examples. They're not an exhaustive list. Each pattern describes the steps involved in the workflow. What are the benefits that that provides? What are the limitations, and when should you use it? So the simple situation of I'm just going to post the request resource to the server of the filling system that I want to do this. And we have a mechanism where you can put a tag on the resource, which lives outside the signature, that designates it as this is something I actually want you to execute, as opposed to something that I'm sending you as for your information. So very simple workflow, but this workflow doesn't allow you to say something like, can you? Yes, I can. No, I can't. Doesn't let you find out where the current state is. It just says, here. And you hope that at some point, somebody's going to come back and actually give you something back, but you don't really have any insight into what's going on until or unless they do give you something back. There's a number of different requirements that we can have. So is the filler allowed to say yes or no, or is it implicitly assumed that they're always going to do what they're told? Because some fillers are well behaved and always do what they're told, but in lots of environments they're not. Sometimes a filler might say, no, I can't do that, but I could do this instead. Is that all right? And so how do we make that happen? Is the placer able to see what's going on? Can they see where you're at? Can they see that, oh, well, the specimen's been drawn, but it hasn't been processed yet? Or specimen's in shipment, but we have no clue where it is. And if it doesn't get here in another 2 days, then we're going to redraw. Can you see that kind of thing? Or is it, nope, we don't have an answer yet, and check back tomorrow? Is the placer allowed to change or revoke the authorization? What happens if the prescription gets suspended? Or what happens if the prescription gets canceled? What does that mean for the workflow? And how does the results of whatever was asked for get to the placer? There's a number of different approaches. So we can use simply posting with a tag. We can use operations. So invoke an operation says process this claim, and magic happens, and you might get a real-time adjudication, or you might simply monitor or subscribe and wait for a claim response to get posted that points to your claim. We have task, we have messaging, we have a number of others. The more sophisticated workflow where you've actually got 3 different players. You've got the system that's asking for something to be done. You've got the system that's actually going to do the work, but you also have an intermediary that acts as a broker that actually negotiates and goes out and tries to find somebody who's willing to execute this. And that might be relevant, for example, in the referral space. So I want a referral to a cardiologist. I pass that to a broker. The broker is responsible for going and finding an appropriate cardiologist who has the ability to see the patient in the time frame required. In terms of what's going on here, you probably actually don't care about those things because most of you haven't been following workflow at all, so we'll skip that. We have introduced a new example scenario resource, which was driven from the workflow space. And that comes out of the need for, it's really helpful when you're understanding workflows to be able to see an example of what actually gets created, in what order, on what system, what's getting passed around. Because workflows can involve hundreds sometimes of resource instances. If you order a lab test for a panel of 20-some tests, each of those might spawn separate tasks and might actually spawn separate sub-requests inside the lab. And all of those things get aggregated, separate observations created, built up into a diagnostic report. And it's useful to see how all of those different resources are playing together. An example scenario is intended as a way of packaging those in an implementation guide to give you a nice visual. We don't have time to dig into it, but take a look at the link there. By the way, all of the slides that you're going to see throughout all of DevDays will be made available to you. That's one of the nice things, awesome things about DevDays. So even if you don't take a picture, you will get the link. We are also looking at aligning some of the workflow patterns with CIMI patterns. CIMI is a group within HL7 that does detailed clinical modeling. So what should a good practice blood pressure look like, or what should a foot exam look like? And they have done this patterning exercise as well, and we're going to be doing some alignment there. We certainly are interested in getting improved documentation of the workflow patterns, so that would be helpful. And a bunch of stuff that we're working on towards R4. We had grand aspirations, and we thought we had lots of time right after R3 came out, but that time has slipped away rather quickly. So how much will be done for R3 and how much will be done for R4 is unclear. If you go to the FHIR wiki page, you can find the FHIR workflow project and see when our calls are, take a look at our notes, and if you're interested in that, you can engage. And I think I have a couple of minutes left for questions.
This isn't a challenge, just pure curiosity.
Yes.
Why is there's an acknowledgement test filled, and then the placer has to send an acknowledgement back to the filler that it knows it's completed, or that's what puts closure to?
So in that particular pattern, you have the filler saying that it thinks that its part of it is complete. And that goes back to the filler. The filler actually determines whether the request is complete, because it's entirely possible that there might have been multiple fillers involved, or that the filler might not have been fulfilling the entire request, or that what the filler did doesn't meet the requester's intentions. So there are a number of situations where the filler might think that something's complete, but the placer ends up not marking it as complete. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Actually, that does answer my question. But that's all automated, but that makes sense.
Well, it can be automated. So workflow is allowing for the possibility of automation. We do, however, recognize that sometimes all of these steps are manual and involve phone calls or people walking into a pharmacy holding a piece of paper. And we will be in a world for some time where there will be a mixture of manual stuff and automated stuff. So the workflow processes describe, this is what it would look like in a fully automated world, adjust as necessary for your not quite so automated space.
I like the differentiation that I've looked over tasks. I guess the question for me is when to be consistent with the appropriate to use, say, a procedure request for a task. I'll give you an example. If I wanted a doctor to enter that they completed medication
Awesome question, and one we were arguing about just last week with the Da Vinci project on that specific item. Yep. So we actually have a change request in to better differentiate between task and procedure request about when do you use each. The guidance that we will likely reflect, I can't answer for sure because we haven't landed the procedure or the change request yet, but the answer will likely be that task is about record management. So insofar as you see reconciliation as a record-based task of here was an initial list of medications, and here is a new list of medications from a discharge summary, and then we're going to operate on those and end up with a final resource instance. That is more of a task-like thing. Procedure is much more about changing the patient in some fashion or changing the subject in some fashion. So whether you're doing surgery or you're doing physiotherapy or you're doing counseling or training or whatever, physically, mentally, spiritually, somehow or other, you're actually changing the patient as opposed to the patient's data.
So education, counseling is your procedure.
Exactly. Yeah, because with education and counseling, I mean, you're capturing a record that the counseling was done, but the counseling action is about making some change in the mental state or knowledge or capacity of the patient. Yes?
In your work group, do you have any engagement on workflow guides, BPMN guides?
Yes. We have a BPMN person who's been showing up semi-regularly and who we try not to annoy too much. Workflow in healthcare is really messy, and BPMN is moving in a direction of supporting greater messiness than it did initially. And so we're taking some of their concepts, but our intention and desire is to still express workflow in FHIR resources so that people can leverage FHIR REST and bundles and that sort of thing to share what's going on.
Do you have a standardized way to, like, for example, like the placer to know if the request has been done asynchronously, like WebSocket or SS?
So in terms of how do the placer and filler communicate with each other, there's a few different options. One of them is you just occasionally pull to see what's new, but you can also set up a subscription. And with subscription, there's a number of different communication options, one of which is WebSockets. So we don't nail down and say that you shall do things this way. There's an expectation or a hope that on top of the base workflow stuff that we're doing of here's all the options, here's the pros and cons of each of them, that in particular problem spaces, in particular implementation guides, people will create guidance and say, in this space, we're going to settle on this particular option, and here's how we're going to do it. Because once you've nailed down your interoperability space, you can apply those pros and cons and say, okay, for us, the most pros are with this particular approach. But we can't do that at the base standard level because everybody's environment is a bit different. One more question?
I have a question about the first part, about when you're going over some of the definitional items. In building like decision support, sometimes we found ourselves using the questionnaire resource, but sometimes that question might be answered by an observation being either existent or valued. Is there any work towards kind of either having definitional aspect to observations, we can define blood pressure in the abstract and different than an instance of an observation? And is there any way to relate that to being able to answer questionnaire? I think I saw like a DA data extension a while back, but I didn't understand it.
Yep. Come to structured data capture. I think that's on Thursday. So first, yes, we are creating an observation definition resource that sort of acts as a lab master file. What kinds of observations are possible? What kind of specimen do you need for them? How much do they cost? All of that kind of stuff. Questionnaire is an interesting resource in that questionnaire response can capture any kind of data. It can capture drug stuff, observation stuff, demographic stuff, whatever. and SDC is about how do you map to and from other resources. So how do you grab lab results and use them to populate a questionnaire, but also how do you take a completed questionnaire and turn that into a bunch of observations or medication records or other things that are easier to query and analyze. So short answer is yes, we are working in that space. They don't give me nearly enough time. And there's another presentation shortly after this, but I'm just going to stand out in the hall and happy to chat with more of you later. That's my contact information. Don't be afraid to reach out by email as well. And thank you.